theme than Catherine's was, although nicely preceded by Mark's earlier, because it is a case study. But in this talk, we're going to be looking at an actual attempt at conceptual engineering made over summer 2020, so just this past summer. I think it's an interesting case because for all the skepticism about the implementation challenge, this attempt was moderately successful in that the concept and its associated term did come to be widely applied in a new way. But I say moderately successful because there was also a tremendous amount of pushback. And quite interestingly, maybe for social media positions in particular, there was a lot of pushback specifically from the very people to whom the concept was being newly applied. So I reckon this is kind of an interesting case study. We can potentially learn both from what went well and from what did not go so well. All right, so what am I talking about? I'm talking about the attempt to engineer the concept hero by encouraging us all, in the early months of the pandemic at least, to conceive of essential workers as heroes. And I'll pause just to explain. So I'm going to be talking mostly about the United States because that's where I live. So it's what I know about. I spent the pandemic first in New York and then in Los Angeles. So for me, the sun rose during Catherine's talk. I'm actually not sure whether the phrase essential workers is being used outside of the US, always the way it's being used in the US. So just to be clear on this category for anyone that's not using it the same way we are. The phrase essential workers is a really broad category. It's being used at the moment to encompass not only medical professionals and first responders, but also people who work in grocery stores, in the service industry, in manufacturing, in construction, in delivery. So it's like enormously broad category. And what happened, at least in the first few months of the pandemic, was that we were encouraged to think of all these kinds of people doing all these different kinds of jobs in a single category, essential workers, and furthermore, conceive of them all as heroes. So that's what I'm talking about. All right, so why did that happen? Well, in the first few months of the pandemic, a lot of us were staying safe at home. And then there were these salient groups of people who still had to keep going out to work despite the risk of infection. So that forced a lot of people to reflect on the extent to which their ability to stay safely at home and continue some semblance of their earlier lifestyle depended on those large numbers of people continuing to go out to work despite the danger. And I think it led quite a few people to reflect, perhaps in some cases for the first time, or perhaps longer and harder than ever before, on the extent to which, even in the before times, their lifestyles depended on large numbers of people doing menial jobs. So based on those reflections, quite a lot of people started to suddenly feel quite grateful. And it became trendy to express that gratitude and express praise for those in the category of essential workers in kind of public pronouncements, especially for individuals who are public figures, for companies, institutions, and news agencies. So here's a representative example. This is from Hillary Clinton's Twitter. Clinton said, "Thank you to the medical professionals, grocery store employees, delivery drivers, pharmacy workers, mail carriers, firefighters, police, nursing home employees, and everyone else who is working to save lives and keep us all going right now. Thank you, thank you, thank you." This post was from March 25th, and this is the sort of thing that we just saw a ton of around that time, so in late March and early April. At the same time, lots of parts of the world also instituted cute rituals where people would go to their windows or their balconies and they would clap or cheer, or in some cases sing for the essential workers. So these were meant to be expressions of gratitude and praise. I've got here on the left the most explicit bit of advertisement that I've seen for the regular clapping. It was really widely advertised. There was this hashtag, clap because we care, that was used to promote the clapping on social media. So this is from the city of Odessa, not in the Ukraine. This is Odessa, Texas. And they say there's a community-wide clap, which is a small way to say thanks to all essential workers. They also note that you can clap from your front porch or honk your horn from your car. So we saw a lot of stuff like this. I also learned recently, I didn't notice this when it actually happened, I learned recently that the US government also flew fighter jets across the sky of several major cities to quote unquote honor essential workers. So on the right here, we see some news coverage from CBS Miami of the fighter jets. They've written, "National salute to America's heroes." I don't feel like I understand really anything about why they did that, but that's what happened. And in addition, perhaps most obviously for people who are living in or have spent some time in the US, the House of Representatives passed an act which is meant to be a stimulus package, so an attempt to get some kind of economic resources and kind of social resources out to essential workers, and they called it the HEROES Act. HEROES stands for Health and Economic Recovery Omnibus Emergency Solutions Act. So clearly this was not just like the name they came up with and then they noticed it had this catchy acronym. On the contrary, they've really gerrymandered this one to tie into the then popular idea that we should conceive of essential workers as heroes and that there's something particularly noble or particularly respectful about doing so. All right, so how did this go down? Well, there was some gratitude for the gratitude expressed by essential workers. There are lots of cute human interest stories now on the internet of how, like, you know, a man said thank you to the woman at the till and she burst out crying, stuff like that. But there were also quite a few raised eyebrows, quite a few vehement denials, and quite a few calls for robust financial and or social support instead of, or at least as well as, the expressions of praise. This, I think, is representative. This is a post that was posted and then later deleted from Reddit. It says, I am an essential worker. Most of us are not heroes. We just have no choice. This is an idea that I'll be coming back to later, but first I just want to note, we can also see here what the two most popular comments were on this Reddit post before it was deleted. So we see that Happy Idiot says, I'm sick to death of the hero narrative, almost like they're trying to use it so they don't feel like they have to pay people what they're owed for working such dangerous conditions. Haha, JK, unless. And Moroccan Gigolo says, it's like what they do to soldiers, call them heroes and send them to the slaughterhouse. I'm going to be picking back on these comments later in the talk as well. Okay, so we've seen some explicit pushback, some vehement denials of belonging to the relevant category from the very people to whom the category is being newly applied. Thanks to the internet, we also have a lot of savage memes. I'll just show you a couple of my favorites. So here we see the media peering through the blinds, cheering on the essential, while they really mean sacrificial, says this meme creator. Ouch. This is a variant on the whoa, this is worthless meme, in which what the kid's holding is a little note that says, you are a hero. And this is interesting because there's a bit of rivalry between different kinds of essential worker built into the meme. So here we see grocery store workers, people who are interacting face-to-face with many of those of us who are able to stay home safely. And the grocery workers are being hugged by everyone. While in the background, the factory workers, that's the cat, are still working, making literally everything you buy, and yet being hugged by no one. I will note at this point, in that list of people that Hillary Clinton thanked on Twitter, she didn't mention factory workers. She did forget those guys. So fair point. Okay, at the same time as these attempts, these encouragements to get us to think of essential workers as heroes, and this mix of a little bit of gratitude and a lot of pushback from essential workers themselves, we've now got a huge amount of data from lots of different parts of the world suggesting that infection and mortality rates from COVID-19 are particularly high in communities in which a large proportion of the population are essential workers. We've even got some data confirming what you might think of as some of the obvious explanations for why that would be the case. So this is pretty interesting. I found this on this website called the Shift Project, which is run by some sociologists out of UC Berkeley. And what they do is they use social media to send targeted adverts to people who are essential workers to recruit them for surveys conducted through Qualtrics. So you can get large numbers of people involved and they can do something that evolves diachronically a little bit. They can see how people's responses change over time. And here they investigated in early March through to mid-April what employers were doing to introduce new workplace safety procedures in the early months of the pandemic for people who still had to go out to work. So here on this top line, we see that by and large, according to the reports of the employees, employers were quite quick to introduce new cleaning procedures. And they were relatively quick to make gloves available. And they were much slower to make masks available and very slow to make either gloves or masks required at the workplace. So when this study was concluded in mid-April, it was still only about 20% of companies that were making either masks or gloves required. I will also note the top line looks quite good, but at the end of April, it's still only about 60% of businesses that have increased cleaning procedures. And that's actually still only a little bit more than half. So that gives you a little bit less than half, just not changing anything apparently. All right, so from data like this, it looks as though the fact that communities with a large share of essential workers are being hit harder by COVID is not just like an inevitable thing. It's happening because employers are not providing their employees with adequate protections. What they are providing are tokenistic gestures of appreciation. So another kind of amusing but also at the same time sad thing we're seeing besides the memes are people who are essential workers anonymously reporting to news agencies information about the patronizing gestures that the companies they work for are offering them in place of adequate support. This is my favorite story because it's like, you can't make this up. These are photos that were anonymously submitted to Business Insider from someone who works at Wendy's, which is a burger chain. So it's similar to Burger King or McDonald's. They wanted to offer paid sick leave to their employees, but they were told they couldn't do that because the business had to remain open. And then somebody from corporate drove over because he wanted to do a kind of photo opportunity to be like, look, we're still open. They didn't go inside the franchise. They stayed in the safety of their car, but they had all the employees gather in the window less than 6 feet away to pose for a photo. And then as a token of their appreciation, they left on the doorstep, not paid sick leave or an increase in the hourly wage, but a small paper bag with a note written on it in Sharpie, in which there was a really, it looks like quite a minimal amount of child-sized candy. Like, you can't make this up. Okay, so we're seeing some essential workers being given like stupid, meaningless gestures of appreciation rather than adequate support from the risk of infection. At the same time, we're also seeing quite a bit of little bits of evidence, although I've not seen any kind of like large-scale graph-like data, suggesting that those essential workers who are interacting face-to-face with members of the public are also often at risk of harassment by those members of the public, even setting aside the risk of infection. So there have been some high-profile cases recently. There was a Target employee in California who broke an arm in a fight with customers who wouldn't wear masks. That was all captured on CCTV. There were at least 3 employees, we haven't got the details, but they say at least 3 employees were injured in a McDonald's in Oklahoma after a woman was told that the dining area was closed and she pulled out a gun and just started shooting. And there was a Family Dollar security guard who was fatally shot in Michigan when trying to stop customers who wouldn't wear masks from entering the Family Dollar store. These are obviously 3 really serious, tragic cases. Thanks to YouTube and TikTok and so on, we do also have lots and lots of videos and footage of more minor altercations in which customers are just yelling at staff or being obnoxious. Okay, so what can we surmise from all of this? Well, my sense is that what was aggravating to essential workers was that they were being hailed as quote unquote heroes rather than being given adequate protection from the risk of infection, and I would add also harassment. And it seems to me that this was particularly aggravating, given that many essential workers didn't feel as though their motivations in continuing to work during the pandemic were particularly heroic. So to repeat, this Redditor says, most of us are not heroes, we just have no choice. All right, so much for the empirical stuff. Now let's do a little bit of philosophy. So there are 2 philosophical ideas that I think we can draw on to help explain some of the pushback that we've seen against the idea that it is wise or beneficial to conceive of essential workers as heroes. The first idea comes from one of the few papers written in philosophy on the concept of a hero. This is from back in the 60s, I believe, 1968. It's a paper by J.O. Urmson, and it's called Saints and Heroes. And in this paper, Urmson talks about different concepts of a hero. There are two that he thinks are already widely understood, and there's a third one that he wants to start talking about. So according to the first two senses of the term hero, says Urmson, a person may be called a hero if they do their duty in contexts in which terror or fear or a drive to self-preservation would lead most people not to do it. And the hero might do that, might get themselves to continue doing their duty in this abnormal context, either by exercising abnormal self-control, I assume, over that terror or fear or drive to self-preservation. Or alternatively, the hero might get themselves to do their duty without effort, I assume, because they don't experience any terror or fear or drive to self-preservation. They don't have any contrary inclinations that they have to control. So those two senses, some thought were already widely understood by the ethicists of his time. And he wanted to get us to talk about a third kind of case in which we call a person a hero who performs actions that are far beyond the bounds of their duty. Again, either by controlling natural fear or effortlessly because they don't have any contrary inclinations to control. And it's this kind of category that Urmson wanted to call our attention to. The idea is that there are kinds of action that seem really praiseworthy, maybe even heroic to perform, but that in virtue of the level of sacrifice involved, don't seem like it could plausibly be someone's duty. They seem far beyond the bounds of duty. The idea of this category is one that ethicists have really taken up and run with, and we now use the term supererogation to refer to actions in this category. One of Urmson's examples was really taken off. This is the example of a soldier who throws her body onto a grenade to absorb its blast and save the rest of her platoon while sacrificing her own life. This example is now quite widely discussed as like the main example of supererogation. Okay, so this is one of the ideas that I want to draw on, the idea of supererogation. The other idea is also from a 1968 paper, I believe, but it's one that hasn't caught on quite so well. This is from Harry Frankfurt. Frankfurt says, there are occasions when a person realizes that what he cares about matters to him, not merely so much, but in such a way that it's impossible for him to forbear from a certain course of action. It was presumably on such an occasion, for example, that Luther made his famous declaration, "Here I stand, I can do no other." An encounter with necessity of this sort characteristically affects a person less by impelling him into a certain course of action than by somehow making it apparent to him that every apparent alternative to that course is unthinkable. And Frankfurt says, I shall use the term volitional necessity to refer to constraint of the kind to which Luther declared he was subject. So when someone experiences volitional necessity, they feel compelled to take a certain course of action, but they're not literally compelled. It's not physically necessary that they perform this course of action, let alone metaphysically or logically necessary. Rather, what's going on is that they've got an overwhelming sense of the importance of their taking a certain course of action, to the point where the idea of their not taking that course of action seems so horrific that they just don't even want to think about it. That's volitional necessity. Okay. So here are some thoughts about what went well and what went not so well in trying to get everyone to conceive of essential workers as heroes. I think there's one kind of cool extension of the concept hero that is built into this attempt to engineer it that I think is quite welcome. And that's the following. So when we think of someone as a hero, we think of someone who's making a significant personal sacrifice that brings about the greater good. Like in Urmson's example of the soldier throwing her body on a grenade, the other standard examples in the supererogation literature all involve fire or water rescues, somebody running into a burning building or diving into a river to save the people who are otherwise going to die in there. And when we start thinking about essential workers as heroes, and to repeat, not only the essential workers that are actually medical personnel or first responders, those that are dealing with actual life or death scenarios, but also those who are working in grocery stores, in the service industry, in manufacturing, construction, and delivery, we expand our idea of the kinds of action that can count as a significant personal sacrifice that brings about the greater good. In particular, we include actions that aren't life or death in any way, but are just marginal contributions to collective goods that are deemed essential for the smooth functioning of society, like restocking the pasta at Tesco, or driving someone's favorite meal from their favorite restaurant to their house. We understand that these more mundane actions do contribute to the greater good, something that we've indeed termed essential. And we understand that they involve significant personal sacrifices, certainly in pandemic times when they involve exposing oneself to the risk of infection, but maybe even also in normal times when you make some sacrifices in not having a more fulfilling career, or not going to uni, or not being able to take holidays because you can't afford it because your pay is rubbish, and so on and so on. So this seems like a helpful extension of the concept of a hero. But there are some ways in which, in calling essential workers heroes, the picture we paint is still misleading. And I think a good way to understand this is to say, in calling essential workers heroes, we paint the picture of someone who performs a supererogatory action and is moved to do so by volitional necessity. So we picture their actions in a certain kind of way, and we picture their motivations in a certain kind of way by saying, oh, they're a hero. Now, I mentioned that the category essential worker is really broad, and I'll admit, this picture, the picture of supererogatory action performed out of volitional necessity, might actually be a pretty accurate description of a lot of medical workers and first responders, the ones that are actually doing the life or death scenarios. So for instance, this is a little like thumbnail of an article in Time magazine that was an interview with a doctor who lives in Michigan and who was going to retire before the coronavirus, and then decided that he kind of felt this overwhelming sense having taken the Hippocratic Oath some years ago to do whatever he could to save lives in this, crucial world historic moment. This does seem like a case of someone doing something supererogatory, coming out of retirement to fight COVID, out of something like a sense of volitional necessity. So this could be the last thing I do on earth. He talks in the article about not being able to live with the idea of just sitting at home while people are dying. But reminder, someone performs an action out of volitional necessity if it's the moral importance of the action that matters to them so much that they can't bring themselves to even think about not doing it. And I claim it's clearly not true that anyone has been driven to work the tills at Costco, British audience read Tesco, or to deliver for Uber Eats because of a sense of the overwhelming moral importance of Costco or Uber Eats. That's obviously not what's happening. Nobody genuinely believes that these things are overwhelmingly morally important. Instead, there is a kind of necessity involved in the motivations of these essential workers during the pandemic because they need money in order to survive and they need to work to get money, and this is the work that's available. So there is a sense in which, in Frankfurt's terms, what they care about matters so much that it's impossible for them to forbear from a certain course of action. But this is not volitional necessity. This is just plain old material necessity. The Redditor was right. They're not a hero. They just have no choice. Okay, so that's what I think is problematic about talking about essential workers as if they're moved by volitional necessity. The problem is that that's false. And also it can be a kind of smokescreen, because if we pretend like people are moved by volitional necessity, we don't have to think about the material necessity that actually moves them. And in particular, we don't have to confront hard questions about whether we think the background material conditions that explain why they're forced to make these decisions are fair or not. So here I want to echo the sentiments of the other Redditor, Happy Idiot, who says, I'm sick to death of the hero narrative, almost like they're trying to use it so they don't feel like they have to pay people what they're owed for working such dangerous conditions. Haha, JK, unless. I mean, I think Happy Idiot just nailed it here, basically. Okay, so what about classifying essential workers' actions as supererogatory? Well, technically, I think that is correct, in that it looks as though continuing to work during the pandemic, even by doing something like stacking the shelves at Tesco or being a delivery driver, it's something that's good to do, but not required. Presumably all that any of us is really required to do is stay home and follow local measures designed to slow the spread to the extent that we're able to. So it does seem as though actually going out to work is something that is good insofar as it contributes to these collective essential social goods, but plausibly not required in virtue of the sacrifice involved. Technically, then, this does seem like supererogation. But an accurate classification can still be misleading. And I think that this accurate classification is somewhat misleading in sort of an interesting way. This part is tentative. I welcome feedback on it. So my sense is that for the paradigmatic examples of supererogatory action, the main ideas you might think of for how to support someone to do something supererogatory would involve you performing actions that are themselves supererogatory, like, for instance, helping someone with a fire or water rescue by you yourself running into the burning building or diving into the river. Seems like that's presumably also supererogatory for you to do, since you're exposing yourself to the exact same risk for the sake of the exact same benefit. Or in the grenade case, maybe you imagine you yourself throwing your body onto the grenade as well, so that the blast is shared, and maybe neither of you die, you both just get serious injuries. That also seems supererogatory. But that's because in these cases, the supportive action that we have in mind is just as risky as the original action. So what makes the original action supererogatory is that it brings about this important good, but there's massive personal sacrifice involved. And there's some sense that the sacrifice stops it from being required. So if we can instead imagine supportive actions that aren't risky, but that help the person to bring about the same massive good, maybe those supportive actions actually can be required. So for instance, with the water rescue, imagine that rather than diving into the river to save the person, you're standing there on the riverbank and there's a life ring literally right next to you that you could just throw into the river. And maybe we have to stipulate further things like you're not doing anything more important and you can lift it and so on. If you make it ridiculously easy for you to support the person performing this supererogatory action, I can get myself into the headspace where I think maybe this would be required. Like if you just stand there and watch them struggle and the ring is right there, it's like, what's wrong with you? So here's what I think can be misleading about describing essential workers' actions in a way that highlights their supererogatory character by doing things like clapping and cheering and writing on Twitter that we're grateful. We can misrepresent our role in the story. We express our gratitude, and so we focus on ourselves as beneficiaries, the people who are being helped by the essential workers, the damsels in distress who are drowning in the river. And we neglect to emphasize the fact that we can also play the role of the inactive bystander who's standing literally right next to the life ring, watching this struggle take place, watching the supererogatory action being performed, and not doing anything to help when they really easily could, which is the position that many of us are in with respect to essential workers during the pandemic. So really, we're both. We are the damsels in distress and the inactive bystanders in this story. One other thing that I think is hard to get your head around when you focus on the sort of paradigmatic examples of supererogatory action, the rescues and the grenade thing, is that we can also kind of neglect to emphasize our role in maintaining the very material conditions that force our heroes to continue to risk their lives for us. There just isn't a role like this in the water rescue example. There'd have to be a group of people that collectively maintain the bank in a really slippery condition so people regularly fall in, and make it so that it's the same folks that always walk by and have to save them and then do nothing to help them. And that's just not a thing that happens, which just goes to show, I take it, that the model we normally have of thinking about supererogation is one of limited usefulness when explaining what's going on with essential workers continuing to work during the pandemic. Okay. So I did say that this was going to be kind of only tangentially related to the conference theme. Manuel did insist when I was being recruited for this conference that it would be fine to just draw out some general do's and don'ts for the project of conceptual engineering implementation in the conclusion of the talk. So that's exactly what I'm going to do now. Do's. These are actually quite similar to what Mark talked about in the session 2 sessions ago. So that's handy. Be catchy, use hashtags, hashtag clap because we care, use social media, get lots of people involved, enlist famous people if you can. I would add here, based on what Mark said, be a famous person if you can, be Kripke in philosophy, or outside, I guess, maybe try and tap Hillary Clinton and see if she'll promote your vision to your concept. And then perhaps most importantly, the don'ts. If your engineering is being done on a concept that applies to people, be very careful not to ignore the salient concerns of the very people to whom you want your concept to be applied. And, try as far as possible to not set things up in such a way that by making certain features of people's actions salient or suggesting that there are certain features that are present when they really aren't, you end up making things worse for the very people to whom you want your concept to be applied. These seem to be the generalizable lessons. I will end with a Google search. search that I did in September when I started writing about this for this conference. I just typed in essential workers are. It turns out the number one result that you get is essential workers are tired. Number two is essential workers are heroes. Then essential workers are getting nothing. Essential workers are slaves. Essential workers are dying. Then essential workers are not heroes. And finally, essential workers are exhausted. So I will stop there because that's been, I think, exactly 30 minutes.